My son dropped his 6-year-old daughter on my doorstep with a garbage bag of clothes and drove away without looking back. 20 years later, I watched that same little girl, now a composed attorney, in a Navy suit, serve him with a lawsuit that would destroy everything he'd built. The courtroom gallery was packed, but his eyes found mine across the crowded benches. And for the first time in 2 decades, I saw fear replace the arrogance that had defined him since childhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Hartwell and I'm 73 years old. People say I look younger, that my silver hair and the lines around my eyes give me character rather than age. But on that September evening 20 years ago, when my son Daniel showed up unannounced with his daughter trembling beside him, I felt every one of my 53 years weighing on my shoulders like stones. I had been preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Nothing fancy, just a simple chicken casserole that would last me through the week. Living alone in my modest house in Riverside, Ohio had taught me the art of efficient cooking. My husband Richard had passed 5 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving me with this house, a small pension, and memories of a marriage that had been solid, if not spectacular. Through the frosted glass of my front door, I could see Daniel's silhouette, tall and rigid. My heart lifted for a moment. Visits from my son had become increasingly rare since his marriage to Veronica 8 years ago, and even rarer after their daughter Isabel was born. When I opened the door, my smile faltered. Daniel stood there in his expensive suit, his jaw clenched, and beside him was Isabel, her dark curls falling over her face as she stared intently at her shoes. The child was clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its ears worn smooth from constant handling. At her feet sat a black garbage bag, the kind you use for long clippings, bulging with what I assumed were her belongings. "Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on? Is everything all right?" He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he picked up the garbage bag and pushed past me into the hallway, setting it down with a heavy thump that made Isabel flinch. "She's staying with you," he said flatly. "I can't do this anymore. Veronica and we've tried, but it's too much." I looked down at Isabel, who still hadn't raised her head. The child was rocking slightly. A motion so subtle that someone who didn't know might have missed it. "What do you mean she's staying with me? For how long?" "For however long it takes." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he'd made since boyhood when he was frustrated. "She's not normal, Mom. The doctors say she has autism. She doesn't talk. She has these meltdowns. She won't eat anything except specific foods. Veronica is pregnant again, and we just can't handle both." The words landed like blows. I felt my stomach twist as I processed what my son was actually saying. He was abandoning his daughter, his own child, because she required more patience than he was willing to give. "Daniel, you can't just leave your daughter here. You're her father. She needs you." "What she needs," he said coldly, "is structure and consistency that we can't provide right now. You're retired. You have time. We'll send money for her expenses. Consider it temporary." But even as he said it, I could see the lie in his eyes. This wasn't temporary. This was permanent. "Veronica's in the car," Daniel continued, already backing toward the door. "We have an appointment with the real estate agent in 20 minutes. We're looking at houses in Worthington, bigger place, better schools for the new baby." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're buying a new house? A house you're not planning to have room for Isabel in?" He had the decency to look away. "It's a fresh start, Mom, for all of us. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices." Before I could respond, before I could fully grasp what was happening, Daniel was out the door. I heard his car start, watched through the window as he climbed into the passenger seat where Veronica sat, scrolling through her phone, never once looking toward my house. They drove away, and just like that, my life changed completely. I stood in my hallway for a full minute, trying to process the enormity of what had just occurred. Then I heard a small sound, barely audible, and looked down. Isabel had finally raised her head, and I saw her face clearly for the first time in months. She had Richard's eyes, deep brown and expressive, though they didn't quite meet mine. Her skin was pale, suggesting she didn't spend much time outdoors, and there was a purple bruise on her left arm that made my chest tighten with concern. But what struck me most was the absolute silence of her fear. Most children would be crying, asking questions, showing some emotional response to being left with a relative they barely knew. Isabel simply stood there rocking slightly, holding her rabbit like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. "Hello, sweetheart," I said softly, kneeling down to her level, but keeping some distance. I remembered reading somewhere that autistic children often needed space, that sudden movements or too much closeness could be overwhelming. "My name is Eleanor, but you can call me whatever feels comfortable. Would you like to come inside and see where you'll be staying?" She didn't respond verbally, but after a long moment, she took one small step forward, then another. I led her through my small house, narrating what each room was in a quiet, steady voice. "This is the living room. I like to read here in the evenings. That's the kitchen where I was making dinner. Do you like chicken?" No response, but I noticed her nose wrinkle slightly at the mention of chicken. I had a guest bedroom upstairs that had been Richard's home office before he died. It still had his desk and filing cabinets, but there was also a single bed with a plain blue comforter that I used when my sister visited. "This could be your room," I said, pushing open the door. "We can make it more comfortable. Add whatever you need." Isabel walked into the room and immediately went to the window. She stood there, not looking out exactly, but tracing the patterns in the frost on the glass with one finger over and over in the same motion. I left her there and went back downstairs to investigate the garbage bag Daniel had left. Inside, I found a jumble of clothes, none of them folded, most of them mismatched or stained. There were a few books about trains, a box of crayons with most of the colors broken, 3 pairs of socks, and at the very bottom, a folder of medical records and school reports. I sat on my couch and opened the folder, my hands shaking as I read through the documentation of my granddaughter's short life. The autism diagnosis had come at age 3. The reports described delayed speech development, sensory sensitivities, difficulty with transitions, and a need for routine and predictability. There were notes from 3 different schools, each one documenting Isabel's struggles to adapt, her frequent meltdowns, the way other children avoided her. There were recommendations for speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral interventions, and attached to each recommendation was a note from Daniel or Veronica declining the services due to cost or scheduling conflicts. My son had known his daughter needed help, and he had chosen to do nothing. Worse than nothing, he had blamed her for being difficult and ultimately discarded her like an inconvenience. I thought about Daniel as a child, remembering a boy who had been bright and charming, but also deeply self-centered. Richard and I had hoped he would grow out of it, that maturity would teach him empathy and responsibility. Instead, we had watched him choose a woman who reinforced his worst qualities, and together they had created a life built entirely around their own comfort and status. I had failed as a mother, not in the ways I had worried about when Daniel was young, not by being too strict or too lenient, but by not recognizing that my son lacked the fundamental capacity for selfless love that parenthood requires. That first night with Isabel tested every assumption I had about caring for children. I had raised Daniel, yes, but that had been 30 years ago, and he had been neurotypical, responsive, predictable. Isabel was none of those things. She refused to eat the chicken casserole, refused to even sit at the table while I ate. When I tried to help her unpack her clothes, she had a meltdown that lasted 45 minutes, screaming and hitting herself until I backed away completely and let her calm down on her own. She wouldn't let me help her brush her teeth or change into pajamas. She stood in the bathroom for an hour, just staring at the faucet, turning it on and off, mesmerized by the sound of running water. When I finally suggested she try to sleep, she climbed fully clothed onto the bed and curled into a ball, clutching her rabbit, her eyes wide open and staring at nothing. I sat in the hallway outside her room for most of that night, listening to her breathe, terrified that she would have another meltdown or hurt herself or simply disappear into whatever private world she inhabited inside her mind. I was 73 years old now, looking back on that night from the perspective of 2 decades, and I could still feel the overwhelming panic I had experienced. I had no training, no understanding of autism beyond the most basic concepts, and no support system. Daniel had effectively dumped his daughter on me and vanished. The next morning, I called him 17 times. Every call went to voicemail. I left messages that progressed from confused to angry to desperate, but he never called back. I drove to his old apartment, the one I had helped him move into when he and Veronica first married, but the landlord informed me they had moved out 2 weeks earlier without leaving a forwarding address. It was as if my son had planned this abandonment carefully, timing it so that I would have no way to contact him, no way to refuse or negotiate or demand that he take responsibility for his own child. I was trapped, and he knew it, because what was my alternative? Take Isabel to social services? Let her become another lost child in an overwhelmed system? I couldn't do that to her. Whatever Daniel's failures, whatever my own fears and inadequacies, Isabel was innocent in all of this. Those first few weeks were brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Isabel's sensory issues meant that most of my house was hostile territory to her. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. The overhead lights were too bright. The smell of my lavender soap made her gag. She would only eat 5 specific foods. Chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, white bread with the crusts cut off, apple slices, plain pasta with butter, and vanilla yogurt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And only if they were served on a blue plate at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. She couldn't tolerate tags in her clothing, so I spent hours cutting out every label from every shirt and pair of pants. She needed the bathroom fan turned on whenever she used the toilet. Needed her toothbrush to be electric, not manual. Needed her bathwater to be exactly 98 degrees, which I measured with a thermometer I bought specifically for that purpose. Every deviation from routine triggered a meltdown. Every unexpected sound or change in schedule sent her into a panic that manifested as screaming, self-injury, or complete withdrawal. I was exhausted within a week, overwhelmed within 2, and by the end of the first month, I understood exactly why Daniel had abandoned his daughter. Caring for Isabel was relentless, demanding, and emotionally draining in ways that typical parenting never approached. But understanding Daniel's motivation didn't mean I forgave it. If anything, my anger toward my son grew stronger as I recognized the depth of his selfishness and cowardice. I had 2 choices. I could survive this, maintaining the bare minimum and counting the days until Isabel was old enough to be someone else's problem. Or I could actually try to help her, to give her the life and support that her own parents had denied her. I chose the second path not because I was particularly noble or self-sacrificing, but because I looked into those brown eyes that reminded me so much of Richard. And I saw a person trapped inside circumstances she had never asked for and couldn't control. I started by educating myself. The local library became my second home as I checked out every book about autism I could find. I learned about sensory processing disorders, about the importance of visual schedules and clear communication, about how autistic children often think in patterns and pictures rather than words. I discovered that what looked like defiance or stubbornness was often overwhelm. That what seemed like indifference was sometimes intense focus on something I couldn't perceive. I called the school district and arranged for an evaluation. It took 3 months to get an appointment, but eventually a team of specialists assessed Isabel and confirmed what the medical records had stated. She qualified for special education services, speech therapy, and occupational therapy. The school assigned her an aide who would work with her one-on-one, helping her navigate the social and academic challenges of first grade. I attended every meeting, took notes on every recommendation, and implemented every strategy they suggested. Slowly, incrementally, things began to improve. Isabel started using a picture communication system, pointing to images to indicate what she needed. When words failed her, expanding her diet to include grilled cheese sandwiches and strawberries. She discovered a passion for jigsaw puzzles. Cheese sandwiches and strawberries. She discovered a passion for jigsaw puzzles, spending hours fitting together pieces with an intensity and focus that was remarkable. The meltdowns didn't disappear, but they became less frequent and less severe. As I learned to anticipate her triggers and help her develop coping mechanisms, by the time Isabel turned 8, we had developed a rhythm, a way of living together that worked for both of us. She still didn't speak much, and when she did, it was often scripted phrases from movies or books she had memorized. But she communicated in other ways through gestures and expressions and the occasional word carefully chosen and deployed. She was exceptionally intelligent, her teachers reported, particularly gifted in mathematics and pattern recognition. She tested several grade levels ahead in certain subjects, though her social skills and emotional regulation remained areas of significant challenge. I loved her, not in the automatic biological way that parents are supposed to love their children, but in a deeper, more intentional way that comes from choosing someone every single day, despite how difficult that choice might be. I loved her fierce independence. The way she approached the world on her own terms rather than conforming to expectations she found arbitrary and confusing. I loved her honesty, the way she never lied or manipulated it because such social games made no sense to her. I loved watching her solve puzzles, her small hands moving with absolute certainty, her face calm and focused in a way that it never was during the chaos of daily life. Daniel never called, not on Isabel's birthday, not on Christmas, not once in all those years. The money he had promised never materialized either. I supported us on my pension and social security, supplemented by a part-time job I took at the local library shelving books and helping patrons with computer questions. It was tight financially, especially with the cost of Isabel's therapies and special foods and the weighted blankets and noise-cancelling headphones that helped her regulate her sensory needs. But we managed. I thought about my son often during those years. I wondered if he thought about his daughter at all, if he felt guilt or regret, or if he had successfully compartmentalized her existence into a problem he had solved by passing it off to someone else. I wondered about the new baby, whether it had been a boy or girl, whether Daniel was a better father to that child than he had been to Isabel. I wondered if Veronica ever asked about the daughter they had discarded, or if they had both agreed to simply pretend she had never existed. The anger I felt toward Daniel evolved over time. In the beginning, it had been hot and immediate. The fury of a mother watching her son fail at the most basic requirement of parenthood. But as years passed, the anger cooled into something harder and more permanent. A fundamental reassessment of who my son was and what he was capable of. I had loved him because he was my child. But I no longer liked him, no longer respected him. And if I was being honest with myself, I no longer wanted him in my life or Isabel's. When Isabel turned 13, something remarkable happened. She spoke her first complete original sentence to me. We were working on a puzzle together, one of those 1,000-piece landscapes that she found soothing when she looked up at me and said clearly, "Thank you for keeping me." The words were soft but distinct, and they carried a weight of understanding that took my breath away. She knew what Daniel had done. She knew that I had chosen to keep her when her own father had thrown her away, and she was grateful. I hugged her then, even though she normally didn't like physical contact. And for once, she didn't pull away. We stayed like that for several minutes. This child who had been abandoned, and this grandmother who had become her entire world, holding on to each other in my quiet living room while the puzzle pieces waited patiently on the table. That moment marked a turning point in our relationship. Isabel began to open up more, using her words more frequently, even though it was still effortful for her. She talked about wanting to be a lawyer when she grew up, someone who could help people who couldn't help themselves. I found her reading legal books from the library, complicated texts about constitutional law, and civil rights that would have challenged most adults. She absorbed the information with the same focused intensity she brought to her puzzles, and I realized that my granddaughter had found her calling. When it came time to apply to colleges, Isabel's academic record was exceptional despite her social challenges. She had maintained a perfect grade point average throughout high school, had scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, and had letters of recommendation from teachers who recognized her unique brilliance, even if they didn't always understand her. She was accepted to Ohio State University with a full scholarship. The first person in our family to attend college without taking on crushing debt. I cried when the acceptance letter arrived, Not just from pride, but from relief. Isabel was going to be okay. More than okay, she was going to thrive. She lived at home during college, commuting to campus because the sensory overwhelm of dormitory life would have been impossible for her. Every evening, she would come home and tell me about her classes, about constitutional law and criminal procedure and legal writing. She spoke in longer sentences now, though her tone was still often flat and her expressions limited. She made a few friends, other students who appreciated her directness and respected her boundaries. And for the first time in her life, she seemed genuinely happy. Law school came next, again at Ohio State, again with scholarships that made it financially possible. I watched my granddaughter transform from a child who couldn't speak into an articulate advocate who could argue complex legal theories with professors twice her age. She graduated third in her class, passed the bar exam on her first attempt, and was hired by a small but respected firm in Columbus that specialized in disability rights and family law. She was 26 years old, fully independent, living in her own apartment downtown. And I was so proud of her that I sometimes couldn't find words adequate to express it. Throughout all of this, Daniel remained absent. 20 years had passed since he had dropped Isabel on my doorstep. And in all that time, he had never once reached out to ask how she was doing or whether she was even still alive. I had looked him up online occasionally, curiosity getting the better of my anger. He and Veronica lived in an upscale suburb of Cleveland. Now he worked as a financial advisor with his own firm, drove expensive cars, took vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. They had 2 more children after the baby Veronica had been pregnant with a son and another daughter, both of whom appeared in carefully curated family photos on social media looking happy and perfectly normal. Looking at those photos filled me with a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was glad that Daniel had other children to focus on, that he had left Isabel alone to grow up without his toxic influence. But part of me burned with rage at the injustice of it, at the fact that he got to live his comfortable life pretending his first daughter didn't exist while I had spent 20 years and every resource I had making sure she survived and eventually flourished. It was Isabel who first suggested what she was planning. We were having dinner together at my house, something we still did every Sunday evening, when she mentioned casually that she had been researching Ohio's abandonment laws. "Did you know," she said, cutting her chicken into precise equal pieces, "that parents who abandon their children can be held financially responsible for the costs of their care, even years after the fact?" I set down my fork and looked at her carefully. "I didn't know that. Why are you researching it?" She met my eyes, something she did more often now, but which still required visible effort. "Because Daniel Hartwell owes you approximately $457,000 for my care over the past 20 years. I calculated it based on average costs for food, housing, medical expenses, therapy, and education, plus interest. And I intend to make sure he pays every cent." The silence that followed Isabel's statement stretched between us like a living thing. I watched my granddaughter continue cutting her chicken with methodical precision, her face showing no emotion beyond mild concentration on the task at hand. She had just announced her intention to sue her own father, and she might as well have been discussing the weather for all the feelings she displayed. "Isabel," I said carefully, setting my napkin beside my plate, "are you serious about this?" She looked up at me with those dark eyes that had never learned to hide what she was thinking. "I'm always serious, Eleanor. You know that I don't understand sarcasm or jokes very well, so I find it more efficient to simply say what I mean. Yes, I'm serious. Daniel Hartwell abandoned me when I was 6 years old. He made a verbal promise to provide financial support and then vanished without fulfilling that obligation. Under Ohio law, that constitutes parental abandonment and creates financial liability." "But sweetheart," I said, my mind racing through implications and consequences. "Even if the law is on your side, suing your own father, it's complicated. It would be public. It would be painful. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" "I'm prepared to hold him accountable," she replied simply. "You spent 20 years caring for me when you should have been enjoying your retirement. You worked extra hours at the library when you were already tired. You went without things you wanted so I could have therapy and the special foods I needed. You sacrificed everything for me, and Daniel Hartwell contributed nothing. Her hands had stopped moving, the knife and fork resting on either side of her plate. In the eyes of the law, he owes a debt. I intend to collect it, not for myself, but for you. The matter-of-fact way she spoke about something so emotionally charged was vintage Isabel. She processed the world through logic and systems, through rules and their consistent application. To her, this wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about mathematical equation that needed to be balanced, a wrong that needed to be corrected through the appropriate legal channels. Have you already filed the lawsuit? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. She nodded. Yesterday afternoon. Process servers will deliver the complaint to his home and his office tomorrow morning. The case number is CV 2024-8847 filed in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. I'm representing myself, though the firm is allowing me to use their resources for research and preparation. My stomach dropped tomorrow. Isabel, this is happening so fast. Don't you think we should have discussed this more thoroughly before you moved forward? I did discuss it, she said, confusion crossing her face. Just now I told you my plan, but you told me after you'd already filed. That's not really a discussion. That's an announcement. She considered this for a moment, her head tilting slightly to one side in the way it did when she was processing social nuances that didn't come naturally to her. I suppose you're right. I should have consulted with you before taking action. Since the lawsuit affects you as well, I apologize. The apology was sincere. I knew that Isabel was incapable of insincerity, but it didn't change the fact that in less than 24 hours, Daniel would receive legal documents informing him that the daughter he had abandoned 2 decades ago was now coming after him with the full force of the law. What do you think he'll do? I asked quietly. Isabel resumed cutting her chicken, each piece exactly the same size as the others. According to statistical analysis of similar cases, there's a 73% probability he'll attempt to settle out of court to avoid publicity. There's a 22% probability he'll fight the lawsuit and attempt to discredit my claims. And there's a 5% probability he'll try to re-establish contact and claim he never intended to abandon me permanently. Her statistical breakdown of her father's potential responses was both impressive and heartbreaking. This was how my granddaughter approached the world, through data and probability, because emotions were too confusing and unpredictable for her to navigate reliably. And if he falls into that 5%, I asked if he claims he wants a relationship with you now, then I'll inform him that my interest is purely financial, she said without hesitation. I don't need a father. I never have. What I need is for him to pay his debt so that you can finally have the resources you deserve for the life you gave up to raise me. The next morning, I couldn't eat breakfast. My stomach was twisted and knots thinking about Daniel receiving those papers, imagining his reaction. Would he be angry, defensive? Would he feel any guilt at all? Or would he simply see this as an attack he needed to repel? Isabel had already left for work, dressed in one of her precisely tailored suits. Her dark hair pulled back in the same tight bun she wore every single day because variations in her appearance felt uncomfortable to her. She had kissed my cheek before leaving, and gesture of affection she had learned over the years, even though physical contact still didn't come naturally to her. I'll call you this afternoon to tell you how it went, she had said, referring to the moment when the process server would hand his lawsuit. Try not to worry. The legal system exists for exactly this kind of situation. But I did worry. I worried that this would open old wounds that had finally scarred over. I worried that Daniel would retaliate somehow, that he would try to hurt Isabel the way he had hurt her before. I worried that my granddaughter, for all her intelligence and legal knowledge, didn't fully understand the emotional consequences of what she had set in motion. My phone rang at 2:15 that afternoon. The number was one I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Eleanor. The voice was older, rougher than I remembered, but unmistakably my son's. Daniel, I said, my heart pounding. What the hell is this? He was shouting, his voice sharp with panic and rage. What kind of game are you playing? Game. I kept my voice level, channeling some of Isabel's calm rationality. I'm not playing any game. Are you telling me you put her up to this? That you convinced that girl to sue me? That girl has a name? I said coldly. Her name is Isabel, and she's not a girl anymore. She's a 26-year-old attorney with her own practice. She made this decision entirely on her own. I heard Daniel breathing hard on the other end of the line. Could picture him pacing in his expensive office with its view of downtown Cleveland. $457,000. He spat. That's insane. There's no way it cost that much to raise her. Actually, I said it cost more. Isabel was being conservative in her calculations. She didn't include the emotional toll or the opportunities one gave up to care for your daughter. My daughter, he repeated, and I heard something shift in his tone. Mom, she's not right in the head. You know that she's autistic. The courts aren't going to take her seriously. They're going to see this for what it is. A disturbed woman with a grudge trying to extort money from her successful father. The rage that flooded through me was so intense I had to sit down. You did not just say that. You did not just call your own daughter disturbed. She's a lawyer, Daniel. She graduated third in her class from Ohio State Law School. She passed the bar on her first attempt. She's brilliant and accomplished. And the only thing disturbed about this situation is the man who abandoned her 20 years ago. I was 28 years old, he shouted back. I had a new baby on the way, a struggling business, a wife who was overwhelmed. I made the best decision I could at the time. You made the easiest decision I corrected. You chose your own comfort over your daughter's well-being, and now you're going to pay for that choice. There was a long pause. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming calculating in a way that reminded me why he had been successful in business. He knew how to shift tactics, how to find leverage. How much would it take to make this go away? He asked. $50,000. I could have that transferred to your account by tomorrow. You think you can buy your way out of this? After 20 years of nothing, you think one payment will erase what you did? Name your price, Mom. Everyone has a price. What's yours? I hung up on him. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. In all the years of imagining what I might say to Daniel if I ever had the chance, I had never anticipated feeling such pure contempt for the person he had become. When Isabel called an hour later to ask how I was doing, I told her about Daniel's call. She listened without interrupting, processing the information in her methodical way. He attempted to settle, she said when I finished. That's consistent with the 73% probability I calculated. His offer of $50,000 represents approximately 11% of the actual damages. Clearly, he's hoping to resolve this quickly and quietly. What happens next? I asked. Now, we proceed with discovery, she said. And I could hear the satisfaction in her usually flat voice. I've already submitted requests for his financial records, tax returns, and documentation of his income over the past 20 years. He'll be required to provide all of it under oath. If he refuses or provides false information, that's perjury, which would strengthen our case considerably. The next few weeks unfolded with the inexorable momentum of legal machinery. Isabel filed motion after motion, each one meticulously researched and precisely worded. She requested Daniel's complete financial history, documentation of the new house purchase he had mentioned the night he abandoned Isabel, records of all the vacations and luxury purchases that his social media had documented over the years. She also subpoenaed Veronica, Daniel's wife, requiring her to testify about her knowledge of and involvement in the decision to abandon Isabel. She tracked down the 3 schools that Isabel had attended before coming to live with me, obtaining records that showed Daniel and Veronica had been repeatedly informed of Isabel's need for services, and had repeatedly declined them. Every piece of evidence built toward a single damning narrative. Daniel Hartwell had knowingly abandoned a disabled child, broken his promise to provide financial support, and then lived a life of luxury while his elderly mother struggled to provide for his daughter's needs. Daniel hired an attorney, a partner at one of Cleveland's most prestigious firms. Gerald Hutchinson was exactly what you would expect, silver-haired, expensive suit voice that dripped with condescension whenever he addressed Isabel in court filings. His strategy became clear quickly. He was going to argue that I had voluntarily taken custody of Isabel, that Daniel had reasonably believed I wanted to raise her, and that therefore he owed nothing. He also began to attack Isabel's credibility, suggesting that her autism made her an unreliable narrator of events, that her calculations of damages were inflated and unsupported, that this entire lawsuit was motivated by mental illness rather than legitimate grievance. I watched my granddaughter read these filings, these attacks on her character and competence, and I waited for her to show anger or hurt. But Isabel simply made notes in the margins, highlighting the weakest points in Hutchinson's arguments, identifying the places where he had misrepresented facts or relied on outdated legal precedents. She's not intimidated by him, I realized. She's not even insulted. She's just working the puzzle, finding the solution. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I had never been inside a courtroom before, and I was shocked by how mundane it seemed. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, uncomfortable wooden benches for observers. Judge Patricia Mendes presided, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes, and a non-nonsense demeanor. Daniel sat at the defense table with Gerald Hutchinson, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He looked older than I remembered. His hair graying at the temples, lines around his eyes. But his expression was the same. That mixture of arrogance and irritation that had defined him since childhood. He didn't look at me when I entered the courtroom, kept his eyes fixed straight ahead like I didn't exist. Isabel sat alone at the plaintiff's table, her files organized in color-coded folders, her laptop open to a document covered in highlighted text. She had explained to me that this hearing would address preliminary motions, specifically Daniel's motion to dismiss the case on grounds that too much time had passed and that Ohio's statute of limitations barred the lawsuit. All rise, the bailiff called, and we stood as Judge Mendes entered. The hearing began with Hutchinson's arguments. He spoke in smooth, confident tones about legal precedents and procedural requirements. He argued that Ohio's statute of limitations for abandonment claims was 10 years, that Isabel had waited too long to bring her lawsuit, and that the court should dismiss the case without even considering the merits. Your Honor, Hutchinson said, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. My client acknowledges that his relationship with his daughter has been complicated, but the law is clear. You cannot bring a claim decades after the alleged harm occurred. The statute of limitations exists precisely to prevent this kind of stale litigation. Judge Mendes turned to Isabel. Miss Hartwell, how do you respond? Isabel stood, her movements precise and controlled. Your Honor, Ohio Revised Code Section 3:13.03 establishes that parents have a legal duty to support their children until the age of 18. When Mr. Hartwell abandoned me at age 6, that duty didn't disappear. It was transferred to my grandmother, who had to assume all financial responsibility for my care. She paused, consulting her notes. The statute of limitations doesn't begin to run until the injured party knows or should have known of the harm. I didn't have the legal capacity to bring this claim as a minor, and it wasn't until I became an attorney myself that I fully understood the extent of the financial burden that had been placed on my grandmother. Hutchinson started to interrupt, but Judge Mendes held up her hand. Let her finish, Mr. Hutchinson. Isabel continued, her voice never wavering. Additionally, the defendant's argument ignores the discovery rule. Under Ohio law, when a defendant has concealed their wrongdoing, the statute of limitations is tolled until the plaintiff discovers the fraud. Mr. Hartwell disappeared completely after abandoning me. He left no forwarding address, accepted no communication, and actively avoided any contact that might have led to him being held accountable. That concealment tolls the statute. Judge Mendes was leaning forward now, clearly interested. Mr. Hutchinson, did your client maintain any contact with his daughter after leaving her with Mrs. Hartwell? Hutchinson shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, my client believed that Mrs. Hartwell wished to raise the child. He thought he was doing what was best for everyone involved. That's not what I asked, Judge Mendes said sharply. Did he or did he not maintain contact? Phone calls, Letters, birthday cards, child support payments, anything? Hutchinson glanced at Daniel, who shook his head slightly. No, Your Honor, there was no contact. And did he provide any financial support during the 20 years that his mother was raising his daughter? Again, no. But Your Honor, the circumstances. Judge Mendes cut him off. I've heard enough. Motion to dismiss is denied. This case has sufficient merit to proceed to discovery and eventual trial. Mr. Hartwell, you will comply with all discovery requests from the plaintiff, and you will do so in a timely and complete manner. Any attempts to conceal assets or provide false information will result in sanctions. Do you understand? Daniel stood reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor. The hearing ended and I watched Daniel and his attorney huddle together in urgent conversation before leaving through a side door without once looking in our direction. Isabel packed up her files methodically, showing no sign of the victory she had just won. That went well, she said to me as we left the courtroom. The judge's ruling establishes that we can proceed. Now comes the difficult part. Actually proving the extent of the damages and demonstrating that Daniel's abandonment directly caused financial harm to you. How are you feeling? I asked her as we walked to the parking garage. About what? About confronting your father. About standing in the same room with the man who abandoned you. She considered this as we reached my car. Her face showing the intense concentration she always displayed when trying to understand emotional nuances. I feel satisfied, she said. Finally. The legal system is working as it should. A wrong is being addressed through appropriate channels. That's all I wanted. But don't you feel anything else? I pressed gently. Anger, hurt. She unlocked her car. A sensible sedan she had bought used with money from her first lawyer paycheck. I used to feel those things, she said quietly. When I was younger, before I understood what he had done, I used to think I had done something wrong, that I had been too difficult, too broken for him to love. But then I learned about autism. Learned that my brain simply works differently than other people's brains. There's nothing wrong with me. Eleanor, I'm not broken. I'm just different. And if Daniel Hartwell couldn't accept that, if he chose to abandon his daughter rather than learn how to parent her, then that's his failure, not mine. She got into her car, then looked up at me through the open door. I don't need him to apologize or explain or ask for forgiveness. I just need him to pay the debt he owes. That's justice, and justice is enough. As I drove home, I thought about what Isabel had said. For her, this lawsuit really was just about justice, about correcting an imbalance and enforcing accountability. She wasn't seeking emotional closure or trying to hurt Daniel the way he had hurt her. She was simply applying the law to a situation that violated it. But for me, it was more complicated. Watching Daniel in that courtroom, seeing him sit there in his expensive suit with his expensive lawyer, acting like the victim in a situation he had created, I felt the full weight of 20 years of anger and resentment. He had stolen my retirement, stolen the peaceful final decades I had imagined with Richard before his death. He had taken the life I was supposed to live and replaced it with endless worry and exhaustion and financial stress. And he had done it without a second thought, without a moment of guilt because my suffering didn't matter to him. My phone rang that evening. Another unknown number, but this time when I answered, it was Veronica's voice on the other end. Eleanor, she said, her voice tight and strained. We need to talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Veronica. Please, she said, and I heard something in her voice that might have been desperation. I need you to understand what really happened. Daniel has painted this picture of abandonment, but it wasn't like that. We were overwhelmed. We tried. I laughed bitterly. You tried. You tried so hard that you moved to a bigger house and had 2 more children and went on vacations to Europe while your first daughter learned to speak with a woman who had no training and no support. Those other children are normal, Veronica snapped. Then seemed to realize what she had said. I mean, they don't require special care. They're easier. Isabel wasn't easy, I said coldly. She was a child who needed her parents and you threw her away because she required more effort than you wanted to give. That's not fair. Veronica protested. You don't know what it was like. The constant meltdowns, the therapy appointments, the stares from other parents. I had postpartum depression. I was barely holding myself together. So, you sacrificed your daughter to make your life easier. And now you want me to feel sorry for you? There was a long silence. We'll fight this lawsuit, Veronica said. Finally, her voice hardening. Gerald says, we have a good chance of winning. Daniel's within his rights to make choices about custody arrangements. Tell your lawyer to read the case law on parental abandonment, I suggested. And tell Daniel that if he thinks I'm going to let him walk away from this the way he walked away from Isabel, he's badly mistaken. This time there are consequences. I hung up before she could respond. The discovery process over the following months was brutal and invasive. Isabel subpoenaed every financial document Daniel and Veronica had. And what emerged was a portrait of breathtaking hypocrisy. In the year after abandoning Isabel, Daniel and Veronica had purchased a house worth $680,000. They had taken a vacation to Italy costing $12,000. They had bought a boat, joined a country club, and enrolled their younger children in private schools that cost $30,000 per year per child. Meanwhile, I had been cutting coupons, working extra hours at the library, and buying Isabel's clothes from thrift stores. Meanwhile, Isabel had been attending underfunded public schools, getting her therapy services only because they were mandated by law, eating the same 5 foods because I couldn't afford a nutritionist who might have helped expand her diet. The contrast was damning, and Isabel documented every bit of it in her filings. She created charts comparing Daniel's spending on luxury items to the money I had spent on Isabel's basic needs. She calculated that in the 20 years since the abandonment, Daniel's household income had totaled approximately $4.2 million, while my income had been roughly $420,000. She demonstrated that Daniel could easily have provided child support, could have contributed to Isabel's therapy and education, but had chosen not to because he believed he could abandon his responsibilities without consequences. I was deposed in January, required to sit in a conference room with Hutchinson firing questions at me for 6 hours while a court reporter transcribed every word. He tried to make it sound like I had wanted to take custody of Isabel, like Daniel had given me a gift rather than dumping his responsibility on me. Is it true, Mrs. Hartwell, that you told your son you would love to spend more time with your granddaughter? Hutchinson asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I said I wanted to see her more often, I replied carefully. That's not the same as volunteering to raise her full-time with no support. But you never refused to take her in, did you? You could have said no when Daniel brought her to your house. I stared at him in disbelief. What was I supposed to do? Let my 6-year-old granddaughter become a ward of the state? Turn her away and let her think she had no family who wanted her? You had choices, Hutchinson said. You made the choice to take responsibility for Isabel. That doesn't create an obligation on my client's part. Daniel made a choice to, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. He chose to abandon his disabled daughter with an elderly woman on a fixed income. He chose to disappear completely. He chose to start a new family and pretend his first daughter never existed. Those were his choices, Mr. Hutchinson, and now he's going to answer for them. Daniel's deposition was scheduled for February, and Isabel had told me I was welcome to attend as an observer. I sat in the back of the conference room and watched my son squirm under my granddaughter's questioning. She was methodical, relentless, asking him to explain every decision, every purchase, every choice he had made over 20 years. Mr. Hartwell, Isabel said, her voice professionally neutral. Can you explain why you believed it was appropriate to leave your 6-year-old daughter with your mother without establishing any formal custody arrangement? I thought Mom wanted to help, Daniel said, not meeting her eyes. She had always been good with kids. It seemed like a good temporary solution. Temporary, Isabel repeated. How long did you intend this temporary arrangement to last? I don't know, a few months, maybe a year until we got settled. And did you communicate that timeline to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell? Not explicitly, no. Did you call to check on me during this temporary period? Daniel shifted in his seat. Things were complicated. Veronica was having a difficult pregnancy. I was starting my business. I meant to call, but time got away from me. Time got away from you, Isabel said, making a note. For 20 years. Can you tell me the date of your last contact with your mother regarding my welfare? There was a long pause. I don't remember exactly. Was it within the first year after you abandoned me? Daniel's lawyer objected to the word abandoned, but Isabel ignored him. I'm not sure, Daniel admitted. And have you ever at any time in the past 2 decades sent money to support my care? No. But he started. Yes or no, Mr. Hartwell? No. Have you sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, or any indication that you remembered you had a daughter living with your mother? No. Have you inquired about my education, my health, my development, or any aspect of my life? Daniel's face was red now, sweat beating on his forehead. No. The deposition continued for 8 hours, and by the end, Daniel looked like he had been physically beaten. Isabel had methodically demolished every excuse, every justification, every attempt to paint himself as anything other than what he was, a man who had discarded his disabled daughter and never looked back. The trial was scheduled for early April. As the date approached, I found myself both anticipating and dreading it. Part of me wanted to see Daniel held publicly accountable. Wanted the world to know what he had done. But part of me just wanted it to be over. Wanted to stop reliving the pain of those early years. Stop being reminded of how close I had come to failing Isabel simply because I was too old, too tired, too poor to give her everything she needed. The courthouse was more crowded than I expected. Apparently, the case had attracted media attention. The story of an autistic attorney suing the father who abandoned her was too compelling for local news to ignore. Cameras lined the steps as Isabel and I arrived. Reporters shouting questions that we ignored as we made our way inside. Daniel was already seated at the defense table when we entered the courtroom. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. Veronica sat behind him in the first row of the gallery, her face carefully blank. There, 2 other children, now teenagers, sat beside her, looking confused and uncomfortable. Judge Mendes called the courtroom to order and Isabel stood to present her opening statement. She moved to the center of the room, her posture straight, her voice clear and unwavering. This case is about accountability, she began. For 20 years, Daniel Hartwell lived a life of comfort and prosperity, while his elderly mother struggled to provide for the daughter he abandoned. The evidence will show that Mr. Hartwell knowingly and deliberately chose to sever all contact with his disabled child, that he broke his promise to provide financial support, and that his actions caused substantial economic hardship to Eleanor Hartwell. She outlined her case with precision, explaining each category of damages, from housing costs to medical expenses to the opportunity costs of my lost retirement. She presented photographs of my small house, of Isabel's sparse bedroom, of the second-hand furniture and budget groceries that had defined our existence. Then she showed photographs from Daniel's social media. Images of his lakefront home, his boat, his family vacations to destinations I could never afford. The contrast was devastating. Hutchinson's opening statement tried to reframe the narrative. This is a case about a grandmother who chose to help raise her granddaughter and now wants to be compensated for that choice, he argued. Eleanor Hartwell never objected to the arrangement. She never sought child support through proper legal channels. She accepted the situation for 20 years, and only now, at her granddaughter's prompting, has she decided to demand payment. The implication was clear. I was greedy, vindictive, manipulated by an adult daughter who couldn't let go of childhood grievances. The first witnesses were the therapists and teachers who had worked with Isabel over the years. They testified about her needs, the cost of services, the dedication required to help an autistic child thrive. One occupational therapist broke down in tears, describing how I had attended every single session, taking notes, asking questions, implementing strategies at home despite being exhausted and overwhelmed. She loved that little girl so fiercely, the therapist said, looking directly at Daniel. She never gave up, never complained, never made Isabel feel like she was a burden. That child is thriving today because Eleanor Hartwell refused to abandon her the way her father did. Then came my testimony. Isabel questioned me gently, walking me through the night Daniel had left Isabel on my doorstep. The years of struggle that followed, the financial calculations I had made to ensure Isabel had what she needed, even when it meant I went without. Hutchinson's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested I had exaggerated expenses, that I had chosen expensive therapies when cheaper alternatives existed, that I could have sought government assistance, but had been too proud. He implied that I was using Isabel's lawsuit to fund a retirement I hadn't adequately planned for. Did you or did you not tell your son that you wanted to spend more time with your granddaughter? Hutchinson demanded. I said I wanted to see her, I replied firmly. That's very different from agreeing to raise her permanently with no support. But you never refused, did you? You took her in willingly. I took her in because I loved her and because I wasn't going to let a 6-year-old child suffer for her father's failures. That doesn't absolve Daniel of his responsibilities. Daniel's testimony came on the third day of trial. Isabel questioned him with surgical precision, forcing him to admit that he had made no effort to contact me, had sent no money, had essentially erased Isabel from his life the moment she became inconvenient. Under Isabel's questioning, he tried to claim that he had assumed I was fine, that I would have reached out if I needed help. But Isabel had phone records showing that I had called him repeatedly in the first weeks after he abandoned Isabel, that every call had gone to voicemail, that he had never once returned them. She showed the jury his tax returns, documenting his growing wealth over the years. She showed credit card statements with charges for luxury items, country club memberships, private school tuition for his other children, and then she asked the question that I had been waiting 20 years to hear someone ask. Mr. Hartwell, did you love your daughter Isabel? Daniel looked trapped. His eyes darted to his lawyer, to Veronica, to me, searching for an escape that didn't exist. He started then stopped. She was difficult. The autism made everything complicated. That's not what I asked, Isabel said, her voice still professionally neutral. Did you love me? The courtroom was completely silent. Even Judge Mendes leaned forward, waiting for his answer. I tried, Daniel said finally. And even he seemed to realize how inadequate that sounded. But you gave up, Isabel stated. Yes, he whispered. Because I was too difficult to love. Because loving me required effort you weren't willing to give. Hutchinson objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard what they needed to hear. Closing arguments happened on a Friday morning. Isabel spoke for 30 minutes, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every financial document that demonstrated Daniel's abandonment and its cost. She ended by turning to face her father directly. Daniel Hartwell made a choice 20 years ago. She said he chose his own comfort over his daughter's welfare. He chose wealth and status over responsibility and love. The law exists to ensure that such choices have consequences. I'm asking this jury to hold him accountable, not out of revenge, but because justice requires it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood and read the verdict. We find in favor of the plaintiff Eleanor Hartwell in the amount of $457,000 in compensatory damages. We further award punitive damages in the amount of $200,000 for a total judgment of $657,000. The courtroom erupted. Daniel's face went white. Veronica started crying and Isabel simply gathered her files, showing no emotion beyond mild satisfaction that the equation had finally been balanced. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us with cameras and microphones. Isabel gave a brief statement about parental responsibility and the rights of disabled children, her voice never wavering, her expression neutral. I stood beside her, this remarkable woman who had been thrown away as a broken child and had grown into someone who could stand in a courtroom and demand justice in her own voice. Daniel tried to appeal, of course, but the appellate court upheld the verdict, finding that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the jury's decision. 6 months after the trial, his wages were garnished and monthly payments began appearing in my bank account. I tried to refuse the money at first, telling Isabel I didn't need it, that this had never been about the money for me, but she insisted. "You earned this," she said firmly. "You sacrificed 20 years for me. Now you get to have the retirement you should have had all along." With the settlement money, I was finally able to retire completely from the library. I traveled for the first time in decades, visiting places I had only read about. I donated a substantial amount to autism advocacy organizations and scholarship funds for disabled students. And I set aside money for Isabel, for the house she wanted to buy, for the future she was building. Daniel and I never spoke again after the trial. I heard through distant relatives that he and Veronica had divorced, that his business had suffered from the publicity, that his other children had learned about the sister their father had hidden from them, and were struggling to reconcile that knowledge with the man they thought they knew. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt no sympathy either. He had made his choices, and now he was living with their consequences. Isabel continued to thrive. She made partner at her firm specializing in family law and disability rights. She bought a small house near mine, carefully designed to accommodate her sensory needs. She never married, never had children of her own, but she built a life that was rich and fulfilling on her own terms. We still had dinner together every Sunday evening, still worked on puzzles side by side, still shared the comfortable silence of two people who had survived something terrible together, and come out stronger. On Isabel's 30th birthday, we sat in my living room with cake she had made herself. Chocolate with vanilla frosting cut into precise equal pieces. "Thank you," she said suddenly, looking at me with those dark eyes that had learned over the years to show more warmth. "For what, sweetheart?" "For keeping me," she said simply. "For choosing me every day when it would have been easier not to. For teaching me that I was worth fighting for, even when my own father didn't think so." I reached across and took her hand. This woman who had taught me more about love and resilience than I had ever taught her. "You were always worth fighting for," I said. "Always." That night after Isabel had gone home, I thought about the long journey we had taken together. From that terrible September evening when a frightened 6-year-old appeared on my doorstep, through all the struggles and breakthroughs and small victories to the courtroom where justice had finally been served. Daniel had tried to throw his daughter away, to erase her from his life like she had never existed. But Isabel had refused to be erased. She had grown, learned, fought, and ultimately held him accountable in the most public way possible. She had proven that being different didn't mean being less, that autism wasn't a tragedy, but simply another way of experiencing the world. Looking back now, I understood that the real victory hadn't happened in that courtroom. It had happened in thousands of small moments over 20 years. It had happened every time Isabel mastered a new skill. Every time she found her voice. Every time she refused to let the world diminish her. The lawsuit had given us financial compensation and public vindication. But the true triumph was simpler and more profound. Isabel had survived, had thrived, had become exactly who she was meant to be. And I had been privileged to witness it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.